Welcome to the Biblical Excavations Podcast. My name is David Nekrutman. Knowing that your time is precious and you're seeking quality homeschool content, please accept my sincerest gratitude for watching this episode. If you feel this is of value to you and your family, please subscribe to our channel and share the episodes with others. The mission statement is very simple: changing the way on how we teach our children the Bible. More than just a devotional approach to Scripture, reading a few chapters, discussing our feelings to these sacred texts, and prayer, maybe a deeper dive can help our children appreciate His Word. I'm doing this podcast in coordination and partnership with Tamara, a homeschool mother of 20 years. She's from Iowa, I'm from Israel. May this podcast be a blessing to you and your family. David Nekrutman here with the Biblical Excavations Podcast with my co-host Tamara. I'm from Israel and she's from Iowa. Tamara, how are you doing today?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm really excited because we have Dr. Quonekuia A from Gordon-Conwell College in Boston. And Dr. Day and I go back a number of years. I actually brought her to Israel for her first time. And she had an amazing experience at Mount Carmel, of all places in Israel. And so I am honored to have Dr. Day. Her bio will be in the description of the YouTube channel. And you can learn more about Dr. Day's wonderful bio. But I want to start off with our podcast. Dr. Day, you're an Old Testament professor. And I'm curious, why did you go for the Old Testament as opposed to the New Testament?
Yeah. I don't know how other people felt, but I felt a sense of calling to the Old Testament. I felt like that's where I landed. You know, every time when I see my students, I say, especially when they have to work on a paper, I say, figure out where you find yourself more comfortable. Are you an Old Testament type of person or a New Testament? And then do your exegetical paper out of that text. So I always felt drawn to the Old Testament. I felt like the Old Testament had amazing stories. Before I knew God, though, I found the Old Testament kind of annoying. So it's kind of interesting that once I came to know, just the power of God, I was like, I love the Old Testament. And so I felt drawn to it. I felt a sense of call. And then I also feel like the Old Testament gives us the insight that we need about who is God. You know, what makes God different than all the other gods that are out there? You know, He's creator. He loves His people. He keeps His covenant promises. And so for me, I always find revival or encouragement when I pick up the Old Testament.
So I'm really curious, which story in the Old Testament really annoyed you? And then when you had your calling to God and you had your altar call moment, what transformed you from an Old Testament story to really appreciating the stories in the Old Testament?
The book of Job was the annoying book because I was in a Catholic college and they made us read the book of Job. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. And it was like so long and he just kept suffering and it seemed like ridiculous. And so, but after coming to understand who God is, like I was like, wow, Job suffered. God restored him. And then there's all these interesting little pieces in Job where the women get an inheritance at the end of the book. Like, where do you see that? That is like this amazing moment in the text. And, God is the creator. He's like, Job is like going on and on, all these complaints. And then God's like, well, where were you, dude? Like, where were you when I opened up the heavens? Tell me if you know where the sea starts and where it ends. Like, God came out with like this energy, like, who are you? And I was like, oh, yeah, God's awesome.
When you were struggling with Job, when Job was annoying you, you said you were in college. So previous to that time, had you had any experience with the Old Testament or the Bible in general?
No, as an African-American, typically in the Black church, you hear a lot about the New Testament. We go to the Old Testament when it comes to Abraham, and we go to the Old Testament when it comes to the book of Exodus. But you don't hear, and then every once in a while you hear, about Ruth and Esther, but you don't hear a lot about the Old Testament. So prior to coming to college, my when I did go to church as a young person, I had heard about the New Testament, but the Old, I was like, what? And so I think what did it for me when I came to seminary, Dr. Kaminsky taught this class on the Old Testament. She taught it in like a story form and she used this acronym called Casket Empty. And I was just like, I was amazed. I got an A+ in that class. I was like, oh, this is the best class in the world. And so yeah, I was drawn to it. Something just clicked in me. And then I think also, especially, I'm speaking from really, just sort of my upbringing, a lot of people try to push Black academics who are scholars into the area of preaching or counseling. And so you don't have a lot of Black people who are in the area of Old Testament. And so even though it felt isolating, I was like, no, this is where I feel God's calling me, and this is where I'm going to stay.
So not only is it rare to have women in academia teach on Christian campuses, on conservative campuses, now it's also, if you're African American, and the field of expertise being an Old Testament professor is even a more rare, precious gem. Is that what I'm hearing from you? Okay.
Yes. There's probably less than, in the book that I read not too long ago, probably less than 60 or 70 of us who have PhDs in the Old Testament, and even less of us who are conservative in our approach to the text. So we're small.
I think this is one of the reasons why I really wanted you to be part of the Israel trip a number of years ago. We're about like 5 years ago we had that trip. And so to me, it was fascinating to see your transformation and really connecting to the land of Israel. I won't talk about our personal conversation that we had on the bus after the Mount Carmel thing, but it was inspiring to see through your eyes what was happening in connection to the land and how the land spoke to you. Because most people, I think, when they're in academia and they're learning about the Old Testament, that because they have the PhD and they could go to the sources, that's sufficient enough, and there's no need to go to the land itself. And I think what happened to many of the professors on the trip, there was this high definition moment, not only walking in the steps of Jesus, but just the Bible in its wholeness is just popped up, and it was like, oh, this is where it took place. And it took on a whole profound meaning for all the people that were part of that academic trip.
I agree. It was amazing. There were two places that I said I would never go. One was Israel and one was Africa. And I was like, Israel, I can read about it in a book and I can see it on YouTube. Why go? And I wasn't going to go to South Africa because it's just too far. I was like, I'm going to lose a lot of life in going there. And those are two places that I'm so glad I've been to. And now when I teach my students, I usually open up, have you been to Israel? They're like, no. I said, you must go. You must go. And you must walk the land, and you will experience the realness of the text in a way that I cannot communicate it to you. And no matter how much you study, you must make that trip.
So as you know, the mission of the podcast is really to change the way in homeschool Bible education we're teaching our children the Bible. And as a professor who's having undergrad students coming in, probably I know that you teach undergrad students when they come in. What is the number one challenge that many students have coming into the classroom, specifically with the Old Testament, or maybe you've heard from colleagues even with the New Testament? What seems to be the struggle, and what is a way for parents to address that at home when they're teaching their own children the Bible?
Right. And I teach now. I have some undergraduates, but I teach primarily students who are getting their master's degrees or being prepared for their PhD. And the number one struggle, I think, across the board with this group, whether it's undergraduate or graduate, is the Bible believable? Has the text been tainted? How can I trust that this event is still happening or can happen in my life today? And so I think one way that we can deal with it, we can always, pick up more books and tell people to read more sources, go to archaeological references such as Israel and Egypt by James Hoffmeyer. We can go to all those sources, but I think it's really important for the person who's communicating the text to actually believe what they are teaching. And I think the sad part that I have encountered as a professor is that not everyone that teaches the Bible actually believes it as the Word of God. So I think for parents who are teaching at home, they also have to have this moment where they say, okay, do I believe it? Do I believe that this is the Word of God? And if I believe it, then that means I'm humbling myself to the text, because we can't say we believe something and then not live it, right? And so the number one thing I believe is it believable? And the number two thing is, where am I in the text? Is there room for me, especially when I deal with women? Does God love me? Do I have a role? Is there anything I can do? And so for those, I would say this where reading the text becomes really important, reading it carefully, because that's where you'll find out I won't say little, but that's where you'll find out things about women that you may overlook. For example, how do we know women are serving at the tent of the meeting? We find that out when it's like in Exodus somewhere, we're finding out they're bringing all sorts of things to formulate the tent. Like they're getting all the materials together. And that's where we get that one little blurb. Like, what? Like, wait a minute. How do we know that women were fighting besides Deborah? We find out, well, there are women on the wall in the book of Nehemiah, right? Because they have to be prepared. If the enemy comes, they have to work and they have to be ready to fight. Just these little lines that are there. So just reading the text in a very clear translation, the King James, God bless it, can be a little bit overwhelming. We need something a little bit clearer, plain English, so that people can read and say, okay, this is what it's communicating. And again, so is it true? Where do I find myself in the text? And I think always is how does the Word of God measure up with others? Like I had someone ask, I have a Muslim convert in my class, and she asked me years ago, is Allah the same as God? And I said, no. I mean, maybe other people believe that. Maybe that's their belief. And I think there's a clear distinction. And so I think it's also important to know how other people see the Bible, so that you'll be able to give a good defense, a good explanation of what you believe, and be tolerable. You can tolerate hearing how people see things differently. So,
how's this resonating with you, Tamara, what Dr. Day is saying?
It's resonating 100%. I think a lot of people, they just move forward in life without necessarily thinking about what and why they're doing what they're doing. And so some people suddenly find themselves homeschooling for a variety of different reasons. And in that, they may think, well, we need to do Christian curriculum, but they're not necessarily thinking, what do I bring to this moment? What do I actually believe? And I think for some homeschool parents, this is the first time they're actually confronted with what they believe. They're typically young, and they may not have wrestled with their faith before. So sometimes what they'll do is just dig down and grit it. And like, I believe what is taught to me because that's what was taught to me, instead of thinking about it, finding those resources. Maybe they didn't go to college or Bible college, and so they don't have those resources. They don't know what they are. And so then when their child comes to them with questions, as kids do about everything, it's so hard for them to know what to do with those questions. And that's why we do this, right? We're doing this to help people understand the art of the question and how we approach Scripture with our questions in humility to God. And so, Dr. Day, what are some of those resources you would recommend for younger parents who maybe they know they believe, but they haven't examined their faith. They don't know what or why. And so when a question comes, they just put up a wall, and it's like, it's because it says it's that way.
Yeah. I mean, that's the easiest way to do it, right? Because you're the parent. Like, it says it. I'm saying it says it. You see it's there. Let's be done with that. I think what's important, because I wrestle with this with my children, is that find out the questions the kids have, because you may have different questions, or you may feel insecure in one area, which is not an area that they're even concerned about. And so I even do this with some of my Old Testament classes when I think I'll have more time to deal with it. I'll ask the students if we have opportunity to deal with something, what would you want an answer to? Right? And so getting those questions ahead of time, like we're about to start studying and, mommy or daddy wants to know, what are some of the questions you have? That gives you the time to get the questions and like do your research, right? And your answer may be that I really don't have a clear answer, or I have to read more about this. For example, my son can't for the life of him understand why Enoch, the book of Enoch, is not in our Old Testament text that we read, right? He's like, it should be there. We've had many of debates about this. It should be there. I don't know why it's not there. There's some good stuff in there. It explains a lot of stuff, mommy. And so, I go back over them with him, like how certain books get into the Bible, how certain books are left out. And so but he's read so much about it that I said, okay, let me go and read it, and then we can have some more dialogue about it. So I think part of it also is being open to the fact that your children might bring some understanding that we haven't even we have ourselves accepted. We just said, okay, that's how it should be. So we might have to go back to read the Bible, a particular book. We might have to get very, very simple books, like just a Bible dictionary. Oh, so wonder what a Bible dictionary can do, but not just an old Bible dictionary, because old Bible dictionaries haven't been updated with new archaeological information. So you want to find, something there like James Hoffmeyer or Hill and Walton on Dictionary of the Old Testament, where you'll have some more recent material that will give you insight as to sites, names, but don't overwhelm yourself as well. It's like we're parents, and it's different to parent. Parenting is different than going into a classroom and teaching someone, because you can go teach them and you don't see them again, or you see them at the next class. But when you're homeschooling and you have a question or you're dealing with something, that may come up again, like, a Saturday, or when you're going to the grocery store. So the questions, it's like you're always teaching. And so I do think you have to also give yourself a break. You may not have all the answers, but make use of more recent dictionaries, Bible dictionaries. Don't just go back to the 80s, or try to go up a little bit further. And you can get these resources. You don't need to have access through like a seminary. Just your library resources. Your regular town library will have an online library, which will have access to academic journals. And so I say start there.
Back to what you were saying with the parents and the students trying to interact with their questions. What are some of the ways you can help parents, or resources you know of, that where they can help their students tackle controversial modern subjects that maybe aren't articulated clearly in the scriptures?
Yeah. So first I would want to know what controversial subject, right, are we talking about? But before, maybe you can tell me which one you're thinking.
Oh, I have nothing in mind. I just know that there typically something will come up in the world, whether it's political or something that's being presented before to be made into a law or a bill, or something even happening in their neighborhood, and the parent. So there's a controversy, but it's not, even if it's fighting between siblings, and the parent is thinking, the Bible doesn't tell me what to do here.
Right.
But the Bible does. They just don't know where to find it.
Yeah. So, a couple of things here. We as parents, first, don't give away how you feel about it first, because if you share how you feel about it too quickly, they may want to align themselves with you, or they might just want to fight against you because they just want to be opposite, but they're really not opposite. They agree, but so kids can be how they are. So don't give away by your mannerism, your tone, or what words you use, where you stand on the controversy too quickly. Right. And as parents, we want to remember, like in the book of, I think it's in 1 Samuel, right? God gets on Eli, right? He gets on him because he did not correct his sons. This is really problematic. And so sometimes we don't bring correction, or we don't have dialogue with our children, and because we're afraid, but God holds us accountable to share with them and have dialogue with them. And also, if we don't do it, someone else is going to do it. So we don't want to leave that gap unfilled. So when we're talking to our children, what I do, especially with my students, if there's a controversy, for example, when Hamas attacked Israel, when that broke out, that my very next class, we talked about that. And I'm somewhere else in the Old Testament, but we carved out some space, 15 to 20 minutes, where people could say whatever they needed to say. We could have dialogue, and with how do we now go back to our churches and what do we do with all that? And so I think for homeschooling, what you have to do is create space, because it may not have anything to do with the lesson there, but create space for dialogue when important events or big events happen. Like, okay, let's talk about it now. Now, based on what we know about the character of God, how do you think God would want us to respond? Based on what we've already learned, which way do we tackle this? If it be issues of abortion, if it be issues of war, if it be issues of injustice, immigration, you want to see how your children are thinking through things so that you then can fill in gaps. But if you don't give them the space to talk freely, you won't know what the real gaps are. And when they leave your presence, they'll get on the phone and tell their friends what they really think. Yeah, I mean, what happens a lot of times with parents who they don't want to have dialogue because they're afraid that the child will lose their faith, that they'll lose their way. And so when they hear certain things, they move so quickly to correct it, and they don't finish hearing how their child is thinking through it, right? So you're like, we're going to correct this. Let me just correct it, that is wrong, that is sin. But you don't know that your child is thinking through, like, God must not love these people.
Yeah.
So you haven't even gotten to how they're processing it to get there. So yeah, you gave them the answer. They're accepting your answer, but we haven't really given them foundation to think through things critically. Like, how are we understanding God? Do you hate God at this moment? Are you angry with God? Do you think that he can't handle that? Oh, he can handle it. Let's talk about it. He's merciful. He's kind. Yeah, he can handle your anger. I remember one time I was so mad with God that I cussed. I was like, this is mad. And then I went to sleep and I woke up and I was like, I'm alive. It's like, and so it taught me that God can handle my anger, my disappointment, and my questions. And I didn't lose my faith.
I want to publicly acknowledge Dr. Day's spiritual guidance in my life. So thank you, first of all, Dr. Day. And secondly, just before we end off the podcast, how would you dissect, like a surgeon, a sacred text of the Bible?
When I'm approaching a text, I like to deal with things that tend to be overlooked or more of a controversy. But if I'm just, so for example, when I'm teaching Old Testament, one of the first things I talk about is the meaning of Ezer. So if I'm looking at the woman as being God creates woman, it says that she is a help, right? And typically in my congregation and our spaces, that is understood as she just helps him do ministry. And so one of the things I would want my students to learn how to do is very, very basic, is to understand what the meaning of a word is. It's most often used to talk about how God is rescuing and saving and delivering his people when they are in a big, big problem. And so I think it's important to, when you're studying any text, is to do a word study and not focus on or lean towards what someone else has already put in, like Logos or Bible Works or Bible Hub. A lot of these programs already do the word study for you, but there's something about doing the word study for yourself that ministers to your heart, and then you can communicate it to people. So me learning that, when God created woman, that, yeah, she is special. She has an attribute that's the same as he uses for himself, right? So you can't be a second-class citizen, right?
Can I interject for a second? Because this is fascinating, because we didn't prep on this before our conversation. So you're looking at the word Ezer as a word alone, as opposed to Ezer Kenegdo as this expression that's quite unique in the Bible. And really I think it only appears in the book of Genesis during the creation story, as opposed to you're isolating the expression. So azer kenegdo is usually this helper opposition. Usually that's the literal translation. Kenegdo means to go against. And it's not that. It's this expression. It's interesting that you isolated the word azer. Yeah. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, because this word is especially in the Black community, the way that it's translated is often just by reading an English dictionary. It's just a helper and a helpmate. And then what you get is that person's experience as to what it means to help. So what does it mean for a woman to help? What that means, a woman cooks, a woman cleans, a woman does this and this and that, right? So, but when we look at the word as it's being used throughout the Old Testament, what else do we see about this word? Is it communicating that? No, there are other things. And so perhaps we should not rely on our English dictionary, but we should look at the word and how it's being used throughout the text to get a good sense of, okay, what is God communicating to us? So I think it's important to look at the word, to look at the context, as much of the history as you can get your hands on. Look at that. And I know we don't always know who the author is, but if we can try to get an idea of what is being communicated, and then we make our application. We don't want to make an application that is just would not have, just doesn't, I don't think God was calling Eve just to, I don't know, do the dishes and stuff. They were supposed to help manage the land, manage creation. I think that was a big deal.
Thank you so much for Dr. Day for sharing and being a guest on the Biblical Excavations Podcast.
Oh, just thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Day. This was fascinating. It's such excellent advice and wisdom for us. And then we learned a ton about the Bible as well, all along the way.